Hello, and thanks for joining us. Coming up on Encore.
I remember her hair. Night and twilight flew down her back, water falling into the air. She is a working woman.
My guest today says if it can't be spoken, it ain't worth writing. A poet, author, and lyricist, Aja Monet is the youngest ever winner of a Grand Slam award for her spoken word performance when she was just 19 years old. She joins us in the studio to talk about freedom fighting and the power of poetry. Aja Monet, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
I've been reading your book of poems. My mother was a freedom fighter, and it's a very charged figure, the freedom fighter. Can you tell me about what freedoms she was fighting for?
Well, the book comes from a title of a poem that is called My Mother Was a Freedom Fighter, and that poem traces the lineage of women of color, of the diaspora, and the struggles they've endured, and how in their pursuit of loving, happiness, tenderness, and dignity, they've had to fight and constantly fight to define for themselves what freedom means and what the ability to love and honor their own strength means for themselves. And so that's essentially what the freedoms that they are fighting for is the freedom to be, to exist.
Basic rights, I suppose. Now, we don't also associate the sort of conflict, the figure of a fighter, with women. It's quite a violent thing to set out there. Do you believe that, like Malcolm X said, that we need to fight for our rights by any means necessary?
Well, I don't know. I don't know if it's seen to be a thing that we don't see women as fighters. I think there's many ways that we talk about fighting, quote unquote, and there's many strengths that we have as women. And so I think fighting is not just the physical blow to somebody's body or the physical violence that we typically talk about, but that there are spiritual levels and degrees to fighting, and that there are emotional and psychological ways that we have to fight. And the one that I'm most concerned with is the decolonizing of the imagination, of the mind, the body, the spirit. And I believe that women have had to deal with their interior worlds in a more deeper, profound way, often because they don't resort or rely on physical strength alone, that we often have to rely on other forms of intelligence and strength. The main purpose of the conversation is that people have the right to dignity, to decency, and to their humanity. And whatever we do in our society has to ensure that for everyone.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of your modes of expression, this is written work, written poetry, but you also come from a hub for slam poetry, New York, where the Nuyorican Poets Cafe is arguably the home of the genre. Elsewhere, it's not perhaps so widespread, perhaps it's a bit misunderstood as a practice. How would you define slam for someone who knows nothing about it?
Well, I try to make a distinction with myself because I believe that oftentimes the term spoken word and slam is used interchangeably, and it's actually a very inarticulate term for a lot of what poets are actually doing. Slam in and of itself started, in Chicago, this guy Mark Smith, and he wanted to find a way to make poetry more entertaining for the audience members, more engaged. So he created this sport, if you will, of the audience judging the person who's performing. And so it became the sport of poetry. However, not every person that slams is invested in the sport of poetry. Some people just write and read poems and recite poems and are engaging in the practice of the oral tradition that we have lived for centuries. And so there's a tendency to call every person who's ever slammed a slam poet, but that doesn't necessarily mean that. So I think that it's just one way that you use a poem, and there are many different ways that people and many different avenues that people go to share their poems.
Mm-hmm. Well, there is indeed a thriving scene in some parts of the world. Recently, Solly Raphael became the youngest ever winner of the Australian Poetry Slam competition. He's just 12 years old, and he beat 1,000 other adult poets to that title. Let's get a taste of the poem that wowed the judges, performed at Sydney's Opera House.
We breathe in, we breathe out. Since the day of our arrival, we've been killing our own survival, and it's vital that our societal title is put aside so we can become one with our rivals. We breathe in, we breathe out. So don't sit around waiting for your life to caper. Instead, grab your pens and your paper, your voices and your eyes so we can reach for the sky and look down on the world and tell them why we need to make a change to our lives. Because we don't have to be these average, everyday humans anymore. We can show this world what we feel, see and think, and that might be the hidden link between peace, war and humans causing our own race to be extinct.
Grab your paper and your pencils. That's a very rallying cry, I think. Aja, you too won a prize when you were very young, 19. And in your poem, Wit, you say that my first audience was a small room of ovaries. Were you already a poet in the womb? Did it start that early?
I feel like that most of us are, whether we recognize it as we get older and come into the world, that we have some calling, some purpose, something that guides us into existence. And so whether or not I was going to write a specific poem with a pen and paper, I do feel that there was some sensibility in me that was longing to be or welcoming the role of a poet. And poetry for me is more, and the role of a poet is more about perspective and how one sees the world and moves in the world, more than just writing the poem. So it's also about the way of being and living. And that's what I'm interested in, is the ways in which we could all be encouraged to be more poetic in our lives.
A certain sensibility. Now, in another poem, Limbo, you write, here there's no such thing as sexual harassment, just old men that never grow up. This was written a while before sexual harassment was on the front of every newspaper. How do you think the airtime that's getting right now is bringing us closer to dealing with this problem?
Well, I think that there's always a role of importance for counter narratives and narratives that shift mainstream conversation to focus on the bettering of humanity and people and our coexistence with one another here. And so it's important for us to tell stories that shake us up and force us to face the horrors we've committed to one another and to change them. I think the hope is not that we just hear the stories and listen to them, but that in listening we become engaged. We're engaged listeners. We're active listeners, and I think that that's the test of this current generation, where it's very easy to post up and share a lot of new stories and new ideas and information overload. But we have to also encourage radical listening and informed understanding of the information that we're sharing. So I hope and I look forward to this current moment encouraging more listening and action based on that listening.
Mm-hmm. Well, indeed, speaking of defending civil rights and women's rights generally, France 24 has been speaking to Al Sharpton, minister and civil rights activist, about athletes who have been taking the knee to protest police violence. Let's hear from him.
The NFL players have demonstrated a real sense of courage to stand up, use their platform to add to others who have already done the same. Basketball players have done it when we were rallying around the racial killing, in our judgment, of Trayvon Martin just 5 years ago. So rather than the president address the police brutality, he's really trying to distract the issue and say they're disrespecting the flag. No, they're bowing, showing respect to the flag, saying they want the flag to represent all Americans.
Aja, you've also been involved in activism against police brutality and specifically how it affects women with the Say Her Name campaign. Do you see that prompting tangible change?
You mean the writing of the poem in terms of, I think that it's a part of, like I said, shifting the conversation. And also, I see the poem as the entry point to evolving our heart and dealing with the interior. So as much as we spend time on our technologies and trying to advance these things outside of us, I think it's really important that we spend time dealing with matters of emotional health, well-being, what we long for and why we're here and how we can better be with each other. I think that the poem is an entry point for that conversation, specifically with that poem, I think that what needs to happen is that we recognize that there are many people dying from police brutality, not just men. And women are always at the forefront of the violence that's been held against people, oppressed people, particularly Black and brown people. So it's an entry point into the difficult conversation, and it's the hope and aspiration for action and change based on that reflection.
And through the arts. Indeed, Aja, we're going to end with a little of your poetry. Can you tell me what you will read for us?
Well, since we're talking about this, I think I'm going to end with The First Time.
Okay, thanks very much for joining us today. Do remember to check out our website, and you can keep up with Encore on social media too. There's more news coming up on France 24 in just a moment. Aja, take it away.
The first time I hated a cop, he was mouthing off his tongue to my brother about how he ought to show him some respect. Carrying on and whatnot, as if my brother didn't have a little sister watching who looked up to him like moonlight and stars on humid nights. Those days he led and I followed, and he kept on like my brother wasn't a skyscraper or something, like he wasn't the bridge that led to boroughs, like he wasn't my hero, like he wasn't the grandson of a union worker who died building a water tunnel for a couple of knucklehead kids trying to turn fire hydrants into car washes. And I saw how brown and Black boys grow into themselves, angry at the world that day, how no matter what a sister did to show her love, she couldn't make a boy no man he wasn't bent on becoming. And even when I thought I was fighting him, I was fighting them. We were always fighting them. All those people out there fighting us, doing everything to remind us of our place. And I couldn't undo all the hate that builds, watching the men you love cower, watching the men you love cower, bend, kneel to the scowls of overseers, all the bright and magic that dims the light, lowers the bright and magic dims, being policed for being too poor, too much a shade, a color, a shade of color, too close to the root, too close to the color, the shade, too close to the color of a beating, being beaten, beating heart.